everyone, welcome back to Say It in Poznań Language, Identity and Everyday Life for international students in Poznań. In this podcast, I talk to international students about how language shapes their everyday lives in a new city, the city of Poznań, and how it affects their confidence, emotions, and sense of belonging. These conversations are not about fluent speech or perfect pronunciation. They're about vulnerability, learning through mistakes, and the slow process of becoming comfortable in a language that once felt completely unfamiliar. Today I'm joined by Lalita, who came to Poznań from Belarus 4 years ago and is now studying Polish Philology as a foreign language. Her story takes us through embarrassment, stress, and cultural distance, but also toward confidence, humor, and a deep familiarity with the Polish language. Let's begin. To start, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us where you're from, how long you've been living in Poznań, and what you're studying?
My name is Lalita and I came from Belarus, and I came to Poznań 4 years ago, and now I'm studying Polish philology as a foreign language.
Thank you. What immediately stands out here is how long your journey with Polish has been. So, 4 years of living in the language, studying it, and using it on a daily basis. That already suggests a very different perspective from someone who has just arrived. But of course, that confidence didn't appear overnight. So, let's go back to the very beginning. What was your first encounter with the language like after arriving here in Poznań? And maybe do you remember any situations that stayed with you particularly strongly?
Yes, actually, when I arrived in Poznań, my aunt, who picked me up from the station, started talking to me, and she was interested in finding out something about me and my relatives from Belarus, but I couldn't say much. I arrived with a very poor knowledge of Polish. I think I had A2, the level of A2, and I was very embarrassed, and it was really stressful. Also, I remember our first meeting on the 30th of September. We were supposed to meet at Stary Brower, and not only could I not get there, our future group mate started talking to us. He was tall and he had a low voice and he didn't speak very loudly. So I kept asking him to repeat himself. And he said, "Am I really speaking so quietly?" And I felt very ashamed at that moment.
What comes through very clearly in your story is how emotionally intense those first encounters were. So you arrived with some knowledge of Polish, but real life interaction immediately showed you the gap between what you already knew and what you could use. So that moment with your aunt, wanting to respond, to explain yourself, but not having the words, captures a kind of linguistic helplessness that many newcomers recognize. The situation at Stary Browar adds another layer. It wasn't just about understanding directions or vocabulary, it was about understanding people. The low voice, the need to ask for repetition, and then the comment that made you feel exposed and also ashamed. These moments often stay with us for a long, long time because they touch not only our language ability, but also our dignity and self image. Early interactions like these can make language feel less like a tool and more like a test, one you're constantly afraid of failing. That fear is closely connected to emotions. So let me ask you about that more directly. What emotions did you experience during the first weeks of communicating in Polish?
I was stressed, ashamed. I felt like I was forlorn and maybe stupid. Also, on the first day, my head was spinning because everything around me was written in Latin and Polish was spoken everywhere.
Your description is very powerful because it shows how language immersion can be overwhelming, not only on a cognitive level, but physically and emotionally as well. You don't just think in a new language, your whole body has to process it. You describe stress, shame, and a deep sense of being lost, and even your body reacts to that overload. Your head is spinning, your senses are overstimulated, and everything around you demands attention in a script and sound system you're not yet comfortable with. What makes this experience especially intense is that there is no escape from the language. It's not something you encounter occasionally. No, it surrounds you constantly on signs, in conversations, in announcements, in everyday interactions. When understanding doesn't come yet, this constant exposure can be really, really exhausting. It drains energy and makes even simple tasks very heavy. What's particularly striking here is that the feeling isn't just, I don't understand, but I don't belong here. Language stops being only a practical tool and becomes a marker of inclusion or exclusion. When it is omnipresent and at the same time inaccessible, it can create a strong sense of isolation, as if you're separated from the world around you by an invisible wall of words. You can see what's happening, you can hear it, but you can't fully enter it yet. And that feeling can be deeply unsettling. It affects how safe you feel, how confident you are, and how willing you are to engage with others. Your description captures this moment with a lot of honesty. The point where language is no longer just something to learn, but something that shapes how you experience the city and your place within it. And yet, over time, something begins to shift. That brings me to the next question. Can you describe a moment when you felt at home in Poznań and what helped you feel that way?
So for me, there are two concepts of feeling at home. So in my first year, I lived in the Piątkowo district, and in the evenings, the district itself reminded me very much of my hometown. And also, when you return from a trip, for example, to another city or even from your hometown to Poznań, you don't feel like you are in a foreign place. You just think, phew, I'm at home. And it's at moments like these when you see the contrast and that realize you are at home.
What is really captivating in your answer is that feeling at home appears in more than one form. On the one hand, there's space, the district you lived in, the evenings, the atmosphere that reminded you of your own hometown. On the other hand, there's movement, leaving Poznań and then coming back. That moment of return is especially meaningful. You don't need to convince yourself that this place is home. The feeling simply appears. And it's only through contrast, through comparison with other places, that you realize how familiar Poznań has become. Home, in this sense, isn't something you declare, it's something you notice almost accidentally. Language quietly accompanies that process. It may not be the center of your attention in these moments, but it's there. In signs, in conversations, and in the rhythm of the city that no longer feels foreign. Of course, language challenges don't disappear immediately. Have you experienced situations where the language barrier made something important more difficult, for example, in social life or maybe at your university? And how did you deal with that?
Yes, but the problem was that I understood everyone well. If they, of course, spoke loudly enough and didn't use slang, but they had a hard time understanding me. When I said something, they just shook their heads thoughtfully. I'm ashamed to admit it, but in my very first year, I knew very little about grammatical cases, and every sentence was a struggle for me. Of course, not to mention the tests, which included translations. My pronunciation was even worse than it is now. And well, I'm not surprised that no one wanted to be friends with me, but the cultural barrier was also a problem. But all of this gave me a motivation to start learning more about the culture and language.
What stands out in your answer is that difficulty wasn't so much about comprehension, but about being understood. You could follow what others were saying, but expressing yourself felt like a constant struggle. That imbalance can be incredibly frustrating. Having thoughts and intentions, but not yet having the linguistic means to communicate them clearly. You also speak very openly about grammar, pronunciation, and tests, and about how exposed you felt socially. Feeling that people don't want to engage with you because communication is difficult can be deeply discouraging. And yet, instead of withdrawing, you describe something else: motivation. These challenges pushed you to learn more, not only about the language, but also about the culture. In that sense, barriers didn't stop the process, they redirected it. To do that, you clearly developed a set of strategies. So let me ask you about that. What strategies help you communicate when you don't understand your conversation partner or when you can't find the right word?
So if I can't remember a word, I either describe it using its Polish definition or say it in English simply, because that's the quickest way, I guess. If I can't remember something, or I just can't explain it, I quickly look for an answer on the internet. But overall, over the years, I have become very skilled in distinguishing gestures, facial expressions, and intonation in the voice, because all this help to understand the person, even if I don't know the language well. And it also helps me to watch the other person's lips, well, because it seems to make things clearer.
What you describe here shows an incredibly high level of your communicative awareness. You're not only relying on one fixed strategy or one preferred solution, you're constantly adjusting to the situation in front of you. Sometimes you describe a word instead of naming it, sometimes you switch languages, sometimes you quickly look something up, and at the other times you simply rely on the context. That kind of flexibility is not accidental. It develops through repeated exposure to situations where communication has to happen, even when language resources are limited. Your attention to gestures, facial expressions, intonation, and even lip movement shows how communication goes beyond words themselves. Meaning is carried not only by vocabulary or grammar, but by the whole body. Tone of voice, eye contact, rhythm, and movement all become clues that help you interpret what the other person is trying to say. Learning to notice and trust these signals is a skill, one that often develops precisely because linguistic understanding is incomplete. In that sense, not understanding everything linguistically doesn't only create limitations, it can also sharpen other forms of perception. You become more attentive, more observant, more sensitive to nuances that fluent speakers might overlook. Communication becomes less automatic and more conscious. And over time, all of this leads to a very noticeable shift. Interactions stop feeling like constant obstacles and start feeling more manageable. The focus moves away from what you're missing toward what you can do. That shift is subtle, but it's also one of the most important turning points in becoming confident in a new language and a new environment. So, for the last reflective question, how have your language experiences in Poznań changed you as a person, especially your confidence or maybe the way you see yourself?
So I'm not afraid of embarrassing myself anymore. Mixing up words moth and darkness, not a big deal. Combining two words to make a third non existent word and saying it with confidence, no problem. Accidentally offending someone, not scary anymore. So I'm not afraid to approach salespeople and ask them questions, because at some point you just don't care anymore, and relax. Do I make mistakes? Yes. Well, but that's your problem if you don't understand me.
This is such a strong moment in your story because it shows a complete redefinition of embarrassment. Things that once felt terrifying, so mixing up words, creating new ones by accident, or offending someone unintentionally no longer stop you. They've lost their power. What you describe is not the absence of mistakes, but the absence of fear. You still make errors, but they no longer define you. That shift from I must not be wrong to I will speak anyway is one of the most important milestones in language learning. There's also something very liberating in what you say, that at some point you relax. You approach people, you ask questions, you take up space linguistically. And that confidence doesn't come from perfection, but from experience. Before we finish, I'd like to ask you one last thing. What advice would you give to foreigners coming to Poznań? Are there any places, events, or attitudes you'd recommend?
So I think there are a lot of events at Plac Wolności, and I think you should ask your friends about some places they like to visit. But my big advice is not to meet, let's say, your people that much. Communicate more with Polish people, with other students. Don't be afraid of embarrassing yourself. So it's okay. People can't learn language without speaking.
What I find especially meaningful in your advice is that you encourage people to step outside their comfort zones, not to isolate themselves only within familiar linguistic or cultural circles. Staying close to people from your own background can feel safe, especially at the beginning. However, you point out something very important. Language doesn't grow in isolation. Encouraging contact with Polish people, other students, and mixed environments requires courage and also a willingness to be imperfect. But as you say so clearly, no one learns a language without speaking it. Embarrassment is not a failure, it's the part of the process. Lalita, thank you so much for sharing your story. It shows how language learning can move from fear and shame to confidence and humor, and how identity slowly reshapes itself through everyday interaction. Before we end this final episode, I'd like to take a moment to look back at all the voices that appeared in the series. Across these four conversations, we heard very different stories, different languages, different countries, different personal journeys. And yet, certain experiences kept returning. Confusion during the first weeks, embarrassment when words didn't come, the feeling of being surrounded by a language that was everywhere but not yet accessible, small everyday situations that suddenly felt much bigger than they should have been. At the same time, each story showed something else as well: creativity, resilience, and an incredible ability to adapt. We heard about gestures, translators, paraphrasing, humor, and patience. About cafes, dormitories, supermarkets, streets, parks, and shared meals. About moments when a foreign city slowly became readable and then familiar. What these stories remind us is that language learning is never just about language. It's about identity, emotion, and belonging. It's about learning how to exist in a new place, how to take up space with an accent, with mistakes, and with uncertainty, and still be understood. For some of my interlocutors, language became a bridge to confidence. For others, it deepened their connection to their mother tongue. For all of them, it shaped how Poznań stopped being just a city they lived in and started becoming a place they related to. Sate in Poznań was created to make these experiences visible and audible, not as perfect success stories, but as honest, everyday narratives. Stories that show that discomfort is part of learning, that embarrassment can turn into strength, that belonging often grows quietly through repeated interaction. If you're listening to this as someone who has just arrived in Poznań or anywhere new, I hope these conversations made you feel a little less alone. And if you're listening as someone who already feels at home, I hope they reminded you how much courage that journey once required. This was Say It in Poznań. Thank you to everyone who shared their story, and thank you for listening.